At first, she seemed harmless, just a rag doll with a sewn-on smile and glowing black eyes. But that thing was no ordinary toy. And that night, we realized that something inside her was alive. It all started in 1970, in Connecticut. My mother gave me Annabelle as a birthday present. I was 22 years old, in my last year of nursing and living with my friend Angie in a small apartment. The doll was big, soft, and made of cloth, something any child would love. But I wasn't a child anymore. Even so, I accepted it, not knowing that I was bringing something much worse into my home. For the first few days, Annabelle would sit on the shelf in my room, intact. But soon, we started to notice strange things. She would change positions by herself, little things at first. An arm that had been lowered was now stretched out, the head tilted to the other side. We thought it was just our imagination, until she started appearing in different places. One night, I came home from the hospital exhausted. Annabelle was in the living room, sitting on the couch. Angie must have moved it, right? But when I asked her, she denied it. I didn't move it. The discomfort grew, but we tried to ignore it. It was a mistake. The next morning, I woke up and saw a folded piece of paper on the floor. I picked it up and, when I opened it, felt a shiver run down my spine. Written in childish handwriting, in red crayon, were just two words: "Help me." My blood ran cold. We didn't have any paper like that in our house, and no one had been in there. The situation got worse. The doll was now moving more and more. Sometimes she would appear in the kitchen, others in the hallway, staring into our bedroom. We started hearing whispers at night, low, slurred, like someone was calling our names. But whenever we turned on the light, the sound would stop. Angie started having nightmares. She said that in her dreams, Annabelle would crawl into the room, climb onto her bed, and stand on her chest, staring at her. I didn't want to believe it. But then Lou was attacked. Lou was a friend of ours. He hated the doll. He always said there was something wrong with it. One night, he fell asleep on the couch. Suddenly, he woke up gasping for air. Something invisible was holding him down on the mattress. Lou tried to scream, but he couldn't. And then he felt it, small, cold fingers slowly crawling up his neck. When she could move, Annabelle was on the floor. The stitched smile seemed wider. Lou swore she had moved on her own. That night, we decided we needed help. But it was too late. The doll wasn't just haunted, she was something much worse. And the next morning, Annabelle showed us what she was capable of. The next morning, Lou woke up screaming. We ran to him. He was sweating, pale, and clutching his chest. When we lifted his shirt, we saw 7 deep scratch marks, 3 long cuts, 4 short ones, as if tiny claws had ripped through his skin. But the strangest thing, the wounds were gone in less than 2 days. Angie and I panicked. This wasn't normal. We had to get rid of Annabelle, but how? We didn't want to just throw her away. What if she came back? That's when we heard about the Warrens. Ed and Lorraine Warren were paranormal investigators. They had dealt with cases like this before. We scheduled a viewing, and when Lorraine walked into the apartment, her eyes widened. She looked directly at Annabelle and whispered, "That's not a doll. That's a curse." The story Lorraine told was worse than we imagined. The doll wasn't haunted. It was a conduit, a portal to something much worse. "Is there a spirit trapped in it?" I asked. Lorraine shook her head slowly. "Number, it's not a spirit. It's something much older." She explained that demonic entities disguise themselves at first. They pretend to be children, lost souls, something harmless. They ask for help. They gain the victim's trust. But over time, they reveal themselves for what they really are, and then they feed. We looked at Annabelle. She looked so ordinary. But now, we knew. This wasn't a toy. It was bait. And we were walking right into the trap. The Warrens decided to take the doll. But first, they needed to seal it. Ed said a prayer. Lorraine held a vial of holy water. But as soon as the first Latin words were spoken, the house shook. The doll fell off the chair by itself. A loud crash echoed through the apartment. The light flickered, and then We heard laughter, software, childish, but it wasn't a child's. Lorraine threw holy water on the doll. The sound stopped, but the air was still heavy. They took Annabelle and put her in a sealed black bag. "Don't look at her," Ed said, and we obeyed. The Warrens took Annabelle home. They created a special glass case, blessed by a priest, and since then, she has never left. But sometimes, visitors to the museum say that when they look into the glass, Annabelle blinks. It all started with knocking on the wall. Roland would wake up in the middle of the night hearing strange noises inside his room. At first, the family thought it was rats in the ceiling, but then the furniture started moving by itself, and the boy was no longer the same. The year was 1949 in the state of Missouri. Roland Doe, a 14-year-old boy, lived with his parents in a simple house. He was quiet, introspective, but very close to his aunt, Harriet. She was a spiritualist and taught him how to use a Ouija board. Shortly after, she died unexpectedly, and that's when things started to happen. The night after the funeral, Roland heard something whispering his name, low, dragging, as if it were coming from inside the walls. His parents ran to the room, but there was no one there, only Roland, shivering, sitting up in bed. The sheets were covered in red scratches, and he muttered only one sentence, "She's here." What started as noises and whispers soon turned into something much worse. Furniture moved by itself. Pictures fell from the walls without explanation. Roland's bed shook violently at night, and sometimes he woke up with words scratched into his skin. Incomplete messages, words in Latin, but no one in the house spoke Latin. In desperation, the parents sought help from a Lutheran pastor. The man visited the house, tried to pray, but something made him stop. Roland's room grew cold. The door slammed shut by itself, and the pastor saw something impossible. A chair slid across the floor by itself and stopped in front of the boy. It was as if someone was sitting on it. The pastor left in horror. He recommended that they seek out a Catholic priest. The family took Roland to the local Catholic church. The priest examined the boy and saw something he would never forget. When he opened Roland's shirt, words appeared on his skin, written by themselves, as if they were burned from the inside out. The boy did not struggle. He just looked at the priest and smiled. That was when the priest knew for sure. Roland was no longer alone in his own body, and the Vatican needed to be called. The request for an exorcism was authorized, and that night, Roland Doe began his fight against hell. The exorcism began in the early hours of March 10th, 1949. Roland's room was transformed into a battlefield. Fathers Walter Halloran and William Bowdern brought a vial of holy water, crucifixes, and the Roman ritual. But as soon as they entered the room, they felt a heavy presence. Something was waiting for them inside, something ancient. Roland lay on the bed, but he no longer looked human. His eyes were completely black. His thin body was covered in deep wounds. And when the priests began the prayer, he laughed, low, slurred, as if dozens of voices were laughing at once. The Latin words filled the air. Exorcismus te, omnis immundus spiritus. Roland writhed violently. The candles went out by themselves, and then a distorted voice came out of his mouth. "He's mine." The bed shook violently. The boy's skin tore on its own, forming marks that said, "Hell." Father Bowdern threw holy water. Roland screamed in pain. His body arched, as if something was being ripped out of him. But then he stopped screaming. His eyes glazed over, and for the first time that night, he smiled. "Do you think you can throw me out?" The voice wasn't Roland's anymore. It was something deeper, older. The room grew colder, and then the windows exploded. Father Halloran was thrown against the wall. Bowdern gripped the crucifix tightly. "In the name of Christ, I command you, leave." Roland struggled violently. His screams were no longer human, but the priest did not stop. He continued praying, and then, silence. Roland passed out. The room was quiet, but in the broken glass of the window, the priests saw something. a tall shadow with red eyes. It was not destroyed, it was just waiting, and then it disappeared. The next morning, Roland woke up. He remembered nothing. His skin was clean. The cuts were gone, and he looked at the priests and asked, "Can I go home now?" The case was closed by the church. Roland grew up, moved to another city, and never spoke of what happened again. But the priests knew. The entity was not destroyed. It just changed targets. And to this day, if you hear a whisper in the darkness, it could be him, waiting for a new soul. Evil came with the wind, a whisper in the night, a disembodied laugh, invisible footsteps in the darkness. At first, they were just noises. Then, they were threats. And then, the attacks began. The year was 1817, in Robertson County, Tennessee. The Bell family lived on a prosperous farm, far from the city. John Bell, his wife Lucy, and their children worked the land and led a quiet life until things began to change. That night, John was returning from the plantation when he saw something strange in the field. A creature, half man, half animal. Its eyes glowed in the dark. John shot at it, but when he got closer, the thing had disappeared, and the nightmare began. That same week, the noises began. Loud knocks on the walls during the early hours of the morning, scratches on the doors, whispers coming out of nowhere. Lucy would wake up in the middle of the night hearing her name, but no one was there. The children would feel invisible hands pulling at their blankets. And one night, the chairs began to move by themselves. That was when the voice appeared. "I am the Bell Witch." The phrase echoed through the house like thunder. The voice was harsh, full of hatred. The Bells were being hunted, and there was no escape. The spirit grew stronger every day. Objects flew around the house. Food rotted out of nowhere. The farm animals died mysteriously, and John Bell began to get sick. His body weakened rapidly. His lips trembled, but whenever he tried to speak, the voice appeared. "You belong to me, John Bell." And he knew he would not survive. The spirit didn't want money. It didn't want the house. It wanted John Bell. And the next night, he woke up screaming. His eyes were wide open. His lips were purple. He tried to speak, but no voice came out. Lucy ran to the bed. Beside the pillow was a broken vial with a thick, dark liquid. And then, the voice whispered for the last time that night, "He drank what I prepared." John Bell died at dawn, the first man in history to be killed by a ghost. But the Bell Witch wasn't done, and before the funeral took place, she would make it clear that she was still there. The morning of the funeral arrived with a heavy silence. John Bell's body lay in the casket inside the house. The neighbors and friends of the family gathered, murmuring prayers. But before the first hymn was sung, the laughter began, low, lunged, sarcastic, and then the voice echoed throughout the house. "He is mine, and now you are next." The church bells rang by themselves. The horses outside reared and fled, as if something had frightened them. The casket shook. The Bell family wept and prayed, but the voice did not stop. It laughed, it screamed, it sang distorted hymns, mocking the family's grief. The spirit did not want that day to be one of mourning. She wanted it to be a horror show, and she succeeded. From that day on, the Bell Witch ruled the house. Lucy Bell fell ill. The children would not sleep anymore. The walls were scrawled every night with words in blood. The fireplace would light itself, spitting embers into the house. And when Betty Bell, the youngest daughter, tried to escape, the thing dragged her back inside. "You will never escape," that's what the voice said, every night. But then, out of nowhere, everything stopped. The whispers stopped. The furniture stood still. Silence returned. And for a time, the Bell family believed the nightmare was over. They were wrong. Exactly 7 years later, on the very day of John Bell's death, the voice returned, and she was not alone. Now, there were several. Murmurs echoed from every corner of the house. Shadows moved across the walls. Mirrors cracked on their own. And at night, the horses in the stable were found dead. with their eyes ripped out. The house was abandoned. The farm was left in ruins. But the story of the Bell Witch was never forgotten. People who visit the place still hear whispers. The bravest try to spend the night there, but no one lasts until dawn. And sometimes, those who enter don't leave. They say that if you go to the old Bell Mansion and call her name 3 times, she answers. But be careful, because when she talks to you, it means she has already chosen her next victim. He was never found. He was never arrested. He was never identified. But his crimes haunt California to this day. And they say that, even after all this time, he may still be out there, waiting, watching, choosing his next victim. The first attack happened on December 20th, 1968. David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were just 2 teenagers in love, enjoying a quiet night in Vallejo. They parked their car on a dark, deserted road, far from the noise of the city. But someone was waiting for them. Someone who had already chosen this moment. Someone who would never let them leave alive. The car had been parked for a few minutes when the headlights of another vehicle illuminated the road. A man got out. He walked slowly to the window. David rolled down the window a little, thinking it might be a police officer, but then the man pulled out a gun. Without saying anything, without hesitation, he fired. Once, twice, 5 times, and then silence. The next morning, the scene shocked the city. The bodies were there, lying on the dirt floor. David was still holding Betty Lou's hand. The only clue, footprints in the mud, and a handwritten note. Confused words, no signature, just a symbol, a circle with a cross in the middle, the symbol of the zodiac. In the following months, he struck again, always choosing partners, always sending letters to the press, mocking the police. The letters were riddles, coded messages, challenges to the FBI. He wanted everyone to try to decipher him, but no one could. In one of his letters, he wrote, "I love killing. It is better than hunting in the forest, because man is the most dangerous animal of all." The signature was always the same, the symbol of the zodiac, and a tally. "I have already killed 7. Who will be next?" The town panicked. No one knew who he was, but he knew who his victims would be. And one day, a man received a mysterious phone call. On the other end of the line, a cold voice said only one sentence, low, slurred, full of certainty. "You are next." The phone rang 3 times. Brian Hartnell's hand shook as he answered. The silence on the other end of the line was worse than any answer. And then the voice came, low, suffocating. "You're next." And the call ended. The next night, Brian was with his girlfriend, Cecilia Shepard. They went to Lake Berryessa, a quiet place surrounded by trees and absolute silence. The wind blew lightly. The water reflected the full moon. It seemed like a perfect setting, but the terror was already there, and he watched them. Cecilia was the first to see it. A silhouette moved slowly through the trees, tall, dressed in black, his face covered by a hood, and on his chest, printed in white, the symbol of the zodiac. The man said nothing. He simply pulled a knife from his waistband. The blade glinted in the moonlight. Brian stood up, but before he could run, the zodiac attacked, fast, fierce. The knife entered his flesh, once, twice, 6 times, each strike precise and silent. Blood dripped onto the lawn. Cecilia screamed, but the forest swallowed the sound, and then she fell. Before leaving, the killer did what he always did. He pulled out a black marker and drew his symbol on the couple's car door. Under the circle with the cross, he wrote a date, and next to it, the phrase, "2 more for my count." Time passed. The letters kept coming. The crimes didn't stop. The Zodiac challenged the police, the FBI, the press. He laughed at them. He felt invincible. And then, one day, he disappeared. There were no more attacks. There were no more letters. The town waited, fearing his next move, but he never returned. The case was closed. The years passed, and the Zodiac became a dark legend. But sometimes, someone receives a letter with no return address. The same old handwriting, the same symbol drawn on the last line, and a count that keeps rising, because maybe he never stopped. Maybe he's still out there, watching, waiting, choosing his next victim. She's still there, standing by the side of the road, white dress, golden hair falling over her shoulders, alone in the darkness, waiting for a ride. Chicago, 1930s. The time was different, but the fear was always the same. My grandfather used to tell this story. He said that when he was young, he would drive alone down Archer Avenue, a long, empty road lined with twisted trees and forgotten graves, and it was there, on that road, that he saw her for the first time. It was a cold night. The car radio played softly, and the streetlights flickered on the horizon. That's when he noticed her, a girl standing on the shoulder of the road, barefoot, dressed in white. She looked fragile, shivering in the cold wind. My grandfather stopped the car. He rolled down the window. "Do you need help?" The girl looked at him, smiling strangely. "Take me home," she asked, her voice low and soft, and he opened the door. The ride was silent. She was staring out the window, as if she wasn't really there. My grandfather tried to make conversation. "Were you coming back from a party?" She just smiled without answering. Her eyes were sad. "Where do you live?" That's when she pointed. "There." My grandfather followed her finger, but his whole body froze when he realized. She was pointing to a cemetery. The car shook. The air inside the vehicle grew colder. The girl sighed, as if she knew he had finally understood. "Don't be afraid," she murmured. And then she disappeared. The car skidded on the asphalt. My grandfather slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding. He turned to the passenger seat. It was empty, but the seat, it was still warm. The next morning, he returned to the cemetery. Dry leaves covered the old graves. He walked among the headstones, his eyes scanning the names faded by time. And then he found it, a plain, white headstone with an aged photo. And there she was, her face, the same golden hair, the same sad look, and the inscription below her name, "Killed in an accident on Archer Avenue, 1933." They say that, to this day, drivers see Mary on the side of the road, always dressed in white, always waiting. And if you pass by there and don't stop, she might appear in the backseat of your car and take you with her. My grandfather never drove down Archer Avenue again, but the legend of Mary did not die. She lived on, year after year, decade after decade. Drivers still see her, and some are never the same. In 1956, a taxi driver stopped in the middle of the road, shaking with fear. He walked into a local police station, pale and sweating. "I saw a ghost," he shouted. The officers laughed until he showed them the back seat of the car. The black leather was still sagging, as if someone had been sitting there, but there was no one. And the taxi driver swore that when he looked in the rearview mirror, he saw Mary smiling at him before she disappeared. In 1973, two friends were leaving a bar late at night. They were driving slowly when they saw a young woman walking along the shoulder of the road. White dress, barefoot, golden hair falling over her shoulders. They stopped the car. "Hey, do you need help?" She didn't answer. She just looked at them. And then she ran across the road, right in front of a truck. The truck driver slammed on the brakes. The tires screeched on the asphalt. The impact was inevitable. The girl was hit hard. The two friends screamed. The truck driver got out in despair, his heart racing. But there was no body, nothing. The road was empty, and the truck driver never drove at night again. In 1989, a young couple was returning from dinner. It was a cold night, and they were alone on the road. Suddenly, the woman grabbed her husband's arm. "Did you see that?" Across the street, a girl watched. White dress, sunset eyes. She didn't blink. "Maybe it's someone lost," her husband said. But when he looked in the rearview mirror, she was already right behind the car, not 6 feet away, standing still, watching. The witnesses keep coming. Time passes. But Mary never left. Some say she can't leave, others say she doesn't want to. What everyone agrees on is one thing. If you're driving late at night on Archer Avenue and you see a young woman in white on the side of the road, don't stop. And for God's sake, don't look in the rearview mirror, because she might be looking back.